Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar, Faith in the Midst of Crisis. I'm Wendy Webster Coakley, Director of Alumni Career Networking, and today it's my privilege to share virtual space with these three amazing humans. Now, before I ask them to introduce themselves, a few quick reminders for all of you who've joined us today. The chat function is your space to engage with the community, introduce yourselves, share your reflections on what you're hearing. Just be sure to select everyone in the drop-down menu so we can all benefit from your Eve wisdom. Now, what doesn't go in the chat? That's right, questions. If you have any questions for our panelists during today's talk, please don't put them in the chat. That is where questions go to die. Instead, just move over to the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar to submit your questions. They'll go into a queue so we can answer them in an orderly fashion at the end of the program. So thanks in advance for that. Finally, as you've been informed, we're recording today's webinar so it can be viewed by those unable to attend. Okay, let's get started. So you may or may not know that earlier in its history, Williams viewed the preparation of its students for ministry to be quite central to its educational mission. Now, this would have been long before any of us on this screen would have been allowed to attend. Today, however, it may not surprise you that the number of alumni who go into faith-based work is quite small, just a few hundred out of 30,000 of us. So there's a reason we refer to it as a calling. So let's take a moment to hear from these alumni who represent three different decades at Williams and who observe three different religious traditions, yet whose personal, professional, and spiritual journeys share some common markers, not the least of which is that all three are the youngest of at least four, and in Rachel's case, 5 children. So this was me when I learned that little fact. Birth order, it's a thing. It's also a subject for another webinar. So now it's time to meet our three panelists. I'm going to start by asking Gail to unmute and introduce herself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Wendy. It's an honor to be here with these other folks from Williams. My name is Gail Henderson Belcedo. I graduated from Williams in 1987 with a degree in political science. And how did I get here? I have always loved the church. I grew up in the Baptist church in Brooklyn, New York. I'm the youngest, as Wendy said, of 4 children. And I always loved the church. My 3 older brothers would have to get dragged out of bed to go to church on Sunday morning. That was never me. That was never my story. And so when I got to Williams, and you know, I'm glad my mother's probably not watching this, but wherever I was on Saturday night, Sunday morning found me at the Williamstown Baptist Church. And not because I felt any sense of obligation, but because that's really where I wanted to be. I loved being in the church. I would spend Friday evenings with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and do some stuff with Fellowship of Christian Athletes, but the church is where my heart has always been. But I grew up in faith traditions, and in fact spent most of my life in faith traditions where women could not be ministers, women could not be leaders in the church. And so ironically, it wasn't until Steve and I moved, he's also class of 87, moved here to Charlotte, North Carolina, and I got involved with a couple of different groups and church activities here. A woman came into a class I was teaching on journaling as a spiritual discipline, and she said, "Gail, you think you're teaching here, but the truth is that you're preaching and you belong in the pulpit." And it seemed heretical to me at the time, but to make a long story short, I know we want to give everybody a chance to talk. After some time of people seeing something in me that I never saw in myself, I went to seminary here in Charlotte. I finished up 20 years of homeschooling our children and went to seminary, a 5-year program here in Charlotte. And halfway through that program, I was hired to work here at Caldwell Presbyterian Church in Charlotte, and happily was ordained as a minister of word and sacrament this past July. So I could talk on and on. That's what ministers do. But I will cede my time now.
That was great, Gail. And now I'm going to ask Rachel to unmute and introduce herself.
My pleasure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being with us. And thank you to Wendy for convening this wonderful group. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. the youngest of 5 kids. Over the course of my upbringing, I participated in a conservative synagogue and then at a Reform temple, and I had cousins at the Orthodox shul in town, and we even visited the new little Reconstructionist community that was meeting in the JCC on folding chairs at that time. And by the time I came to Williams, I was already very much in love with the many flavors of Jewish tradition. I started attending services at the Jewish Religious Center pretty much as soon as I got here, spent some time there. Although most of my memories of religious life at Williams are of illegally lighting Shabbat candles in my dorm room and blessing a bottle of something that perhaps I wasn't actually old enough to buy for Kiddush with one of my dearest Williams friends. I felt a calling to the rabbinate in college, but my boyfriend at the time, later my husband of 20 years, Ethan Zuckerman, class of 93, is not Jewish. And I didn't know of a seminary that would take me, so I pursued an MFA instead in creative writing. I led a local arts nonprofit for a number of years here in Northern Berkshire. And then I found a rabbinical school that was the right fit. And 10 years ago, I started serving as the rabbi of the synagogue in North Adams, where now my son is about to become bar mitzvah, and my beloved ex, Ethan, class of 93, now shows up to bring our kid to services. So that's me in a nutshell. It's a pleasure to be with y'all.
Thank you, Rachel. And finally, our token 21st century graduate, Karam. Welcome.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Williams family. Grateful to be here and honored to share a panel with such amazing people. I was born in Pakistan, but I grew up in Jamaica in the Caribbean. And Jamaica was a wonderful place to grow up. But my parents, my family, they were acutely aware of us being minorities, us being different. They were hesitant to acculturate and acclimate to Jamaica for several years early on, as I think is not unusual among new or first-time immigrants. But I observed from them a commitment to faith and a commitment to values that sort of, I think, imbued in me a sense of wonder and awe about how they conducted themselves. It wasn't until, when I came to Williams in 99, class of 2003, it was the first day of, first Tuesday morning of class of junior year that 9/11 happened. And that was a difficult time. I felt a lot of eyes on me, spotlight on me. I felt compelled to speak about my faith and my tradition and my culture when I'm not sure I had the competency yet. It did push me on a path for the next several years to study on my own. And then it was maybe only a short 6 or 7 years ago when I was working in a marketing firm as a tech writer, doing product briefs and white papers. And the company leadership would talk about transforming people's lives because cell phones had better batteries and better able to, remove pixels and artifacts in your video. And I believe that they meant it and they were sincere and they loved the idea behind it, but it didn't resonate with me. And I was thinking about what else I could have been doing. I didn't do anything about it. I was happy to work there, I guess. Then funding dried up, it shuttered. And I was sitting at home on the couch watching the news. And Ferguson, Missouri was on the news, a suburb of my wife's hometown of St. Louis, Missouri. And we were watching APCs and tanks drive down the street. And I felt like there was some intervention that had gone missing, that things had already escalated too far had gone beyond the pale because somewhere somebody couldn't say the right words to bring people to a table together. I turned to my wife and said, I'm going to join the police department. And she turned to me and said, no, you're not. She said, instead, why don't you come and meet the chaplain that I work with at my hospital? I said, I don't understand what that has to do with anything. She said that this guy is able to see people where they are, families that are in the midst of crisis over their dying loved one, different members of a multidisciplinary team at the hospital that are advising different goals of care. And he's able to create a space where, voices are heard, dignity is conferred. And even if the outcome isn't ideal, there's still a sense of an exchange of ideas and a respect that is transferred and honored. And so that's what got me going. And so it's been hospital chaplaincy ever since.
Amazing. Thank you, all three of you, for sharing your journeys. It was really a special moment and can't wait to hear more of that. We're going to delve a little deeper now. And to audience, just so you know, the four of us had gotten together earlier, and I think we agreed this could have been a 2 or 3 hour webinar. So this is sort of how we edited ourselves. But Gail, we're going to start with you. So if there are 2 or 3 things that your faith and faith practices have taught for you or reinforced for you during COVID, we'd love to hear those. And then sort of secondarily, how maybe are those learnings sustaining you going forward?
Thank you. I would say a couple of the things that I learned during COVID related to my faith and faith practices is that the practices that I have engaged in throughout most of my adult life, prayer, regular Bible reading and Bible study, taking time to be in silence and solitude, journaling as a spiritual discipline is a huge part of what I do, that those things got me through this time of crisis, that it was preparing in times of comfort and ease without high levels of stress and crisis. That preparation got me ready for this. I will tell you, this is not the first, and I know it would be true for every one of us on the panel and everyone who's listening, that this is not the first crisis, right? Like I went through breast cancer in 2012 and 2013 and really had to cling to these practices then as well. And I would say the second thing that comes along with that is recognizing that some people are chronically in crisis. And that's not an indictment on them, but if you have a chronic illness, if there's an issue in your family or in your community that makes life hard for you a lot of the time, for me, I would say I could not get through those things. I could not have gotten through cancer or COVID without my faith. And my faith that offers me hope for the future, right? Based on what I understand about and believe about God, that God's faithfulness up until now has gotten me through this time. And so, as the saying goes, my husband and I say this a lot, hope is not a strategy, but hope is crucial for creating strategy to get through these times of crisis. And this is not the first one. This is not the last one. I recently read a piece that said something that the title was Assembly Required in relation to faith. We need one another. That's another one of the things that I definitely learned, is that even though we would agree that online gathering is not the same, we do need to assemble. We need to have community and connection. I definitely learned that. And in terms of going forward, I'm going to hopefully be able to continue to do all these things, to practice them, to share them, and to constantly just sort of be reminded that faith, this is what faith is about. Faith and faith practices are to get us into and through these difficult times. And for me, ultimately also at the other end of it, for me personally, in my own faith tradition, death is not the end. So I don't have to even be afraid of that. So that faith and faith practices get me to this and through this and all the way on to the other side.
Great. Thank you very much. Along the same lines, Rachel, what are some of the unexpected silver linings that you've encountered in your work during the past 20 months?
When the pandemic began, or when we became aware of it here, it was March of 2020, and Passover would be the following month. And I distinctly remember talking to my synagogue leadership about how we hoped that if we all locked down for 1 month, we would be able to come back together for Passover, for Second Seder, right? It sounds ridiculous now, but who knew then what was coming? And as it became clear that we could not gather our community for Seder, for the Festival of Liberation, where we commemorate, leaving the narrow place of slavery and emerging into freedom, we're going to have to do it on Zoom, which did not sound exciting. I partnered up with one of my best friends and clergy colleagues in the Bronx, Rabbi David Evan Marcus, who's Williams' class of '94. We sang a cappella together, along with a few of the other folks who are on this webinar. And we planned a Zoom Seder, which none of us had ever done before. And it was an opportunity for collaboration and collegiality and sweetness. And we got to share the load. We're both solo clergy people, and so having someone to partner with was huge. And just to hear the voice of a beloved friend singing through my screen helped me feel less alone in my living room. The other thing that he and I did together is, shortly before the pandemic, we had co-founded a spiritual innovation incubator called Bayit, which is Hebrew for house or home. And when the pandemic began, we convened a liturgical arts working group of liturgists and poets and artists to create new liturgy for this moment, designed to be shared over Zoom or over slides or through our screens, speaking to the spiritual needs of this moment. And that's been an incredibly fertile and fruitful collaboration that I don't know if we would have done it in the same way were it not for the pandemic. And a first book arising out of that will be coming out later this year. So some silver linings and some sweetness there.
When the book comes out, you have to be sure to get it installed on Eve's Bookshelf, which is the online repository of alumni authored works. Fantastic. I love that it was a alumni to alumni collaboration between solo clergy, as you said. Karam, your situation's a bit different. You are a religious figure in a secular institution, which is a hospital where many receive end-of-life care. Furthermore, you are a Muslim who, in this context, is an interfaith religious leader, one who's chosen not to take the title of imam, and you can share a little bit about maybe why that decision was made. But maybe you could also talk a little bit about how you navigate religious authority in your tradition, where perhaps some might feel that you don't check enough of the boxes, or perhaps that has changed as a result of COVID. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. Well, so there is a fair amount of end-of-life care and responsibility as part of the job, but end-of-life isn't all of it. I like to think that we can play a role from the start of the journey, from diagnosis right until wherever that leads. And I guess the reason, the spirit behind that is to think that all losses must be mourned, and all mourning must take the form of some shape in grief. And so even if it is a simple, like that is, for some small setback, that might be the appropriate expression of grief, and it doesn't need to be some sort of wailing or anything like that. But to turn to the question, okay, of course, I'm speaking just for myself here, and I hope no Muslims or anybody else who's on it feels like I'm doing them wrong when I speak for myself. But I guess I should say I had the good fortune of being born male and then entering into this profession, is that it has been easier than I think it would have been had I been a woman. Uh, I think that there are, or I felt myself in some ways, in some of my belief, in some of my practices, that I was at the margins of what orthodoxy might be considered, or at least how I imagined and projected orthodoxy. And so I felt a sort of inconsistency inside me. Like I couldn't be really myself. And I think once I learned to embrace who I was and accept that I was enough as I was and that my commitment was sincere, that I broke down the walls that I had erected against myself. So you have to know your stuff about your tradition and your books, but you have to know yourself as well. Just like a student is going to know within the first 30 seconds of the class whether or not the instructor wants to be there. I feel like the community and clergy and congregation will know, do you really want to be here? And so you have to find a way to make yourself want to be there. What does the you that wants to be there look like? And how do they present themselves? How do they behave? I've elected to not use the title of imam because my tradition is still struggling with affording that title largely to women and more openly to women. So if and when the time comes that it can be a little bit more egalitarian, at least at that level, I may reconsider it. But I enjoy chaplain. I don't feel like it undercuts or takes away from the authority I have in the hospital. I'll start there. I hope Gail or Rachel have a few thoughts on that question as well, though.
Well, I would add, I appreciate you, both things you said. I think start at the beginning and at the end about recognizing the ease that you have had because you were born male, and also deeply honor and thank you for your stance to say, I don't want to take on that title until it is more equally distributed. I wish that more leaders in nearly every religion that I know of, every faith practice tradition that I know of would do that, because, well, y'all don't really want to get me started, but I definitely feel like in almost every faith tradition that I know, there have always been more women present, right? Holding it up, holding it together, doing the work, but then not given that opportunity. So thank you again for saying that. And also that in what you were talking about in terms of helping people to understand or to get a new view of their journey from the time of diagnosis to whatever comes. I think that's also a fantastic description of what it is to be a faith leader, right? That whatever the diagnosis, whether it's medical or relational or whatever, that we get to walk with people as they face the diagnosis and walk through to whatever is the end of their journey. Mm-hmm.
Rachel, do you have any thoughts you want to add, or? Oh, good.
I'm good. Gail spoke for me there.
Yeah. Yeah, that was great. So I guess maybe continuing on this theme of decoupling the work of ministry from, traditional consecrated spaces. Gail, I remember when the four of us met earlier, you spoke very passionately about how your awareness that the sacred, is all around us has grown considerably during COVID, another silver lining. So now you're more likely to just, go for a walk with those who are seeking your counsel and care, for example. I've seen churches imposing ashes, on a drive-through basis now. I mean, all kinds of things. So do you think sort of the combination of digital access, such as what Rachel was describing earlier with like the virtual Seder, and then this sort of figurative taking down of the walls, I mean, it might be how people start incorporating religious practice going forward? I mean, even after the trauma of COVID has dissipated?
I sure hope so. I mean, I think what I've thought a lot about during COVID and now, even as we've been preparing for this conversation, is that faith was never meant to be contained within the walls of a specific building, right? So even though a lot of our traditions are such that, and again, I grew up in traditions, and the tradition I'm in now is still on a certain level says these certain activities can only happen in this place, endorsed by specific people. But I don't believe that that's what faith really is. I don't believe that, because I feel like if the things that we talk about and claim and sing and say that we believe, if they don't help me and accompany me when I'm at home with my family or out on the street or dealing with people who don't know how to deal with me as a Black woman, if my faith doesn't hold me in those moments, then I have to ask myself, what good is my faith? And so I hope that as I am walking along with people in my own congregation and broader and wider than that, that we can understand that, this phrase I've been throwing around a lot lately, like if it's not helping us out on these wild streets, then what are we doing with it? And what is it for? Again, I do believe that gathering together is vitally important within our faith traditions, to pray together, to eat together whenever that's possible. But I think that faith has to meet us where we are, whether it's online or out in the world or everywhere that we are. And if I, as a faith leader, if we as faith leaders aren't figuring that out, how and helping those who are under our care to make faith real, then I know I've got a lot more work to do. I know I have a lot more work to do, but if I can't help people to take faith with them when they leave this building, then I feel like I'm not really doing my job well.
Yeah. We're sort of I can't believe it, at the halfway point of our program already. So just wanted to remind all of our attendees, because I can see from the chat that what our panelists are saying is really resonating with you. But if you have questions that you'd like to ask any of them, just go ahead and put them in the Q&A now, so we can get organized to answer them, and be sure we answer all of them at the end. So don't be shy.
Wendy,
Okay.
can I add something to what Gil just said?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Thank you. So that resonates profoundly, and it's so heartening to hear about of a leader, a clergy person who's thinking about what's happening outside the walls of the parish, where I feel like a big part of my responsibility in the hospital is to empower connections outside of it, that their relationship with the chaplain is going to be brief for the most part. It's going to, or intermittent at best, and maybe unreliable at times because of scheduling and deferring to the medical needs and that the patient might have. So one of our core responsibilities is to invite them to consider what kind of resources they may have in their home, around their homes, in their communities, with their family, a faith community if possible, because that is more sustaining, right? So it is about our job, I feel like, is more reminding people that there's people like you out there, being that bridge, that connection point, rather than trying to create the community with somebody who, like I said, it will not have that sort of presence in their lives. So thank you.
And if I could dovetail with that, one of Judaism's dominant metaphors over the last couple thousand years, since our temples in Jerusalem were destroyed, is that there's this metaphor that in some way God goes into exile with us, right? That the presence of God, which one of our names for that presence is Shekhinah, goes into exile with the Jewish people when we are, right, when we lose the land. And so when we all had to leave our sacred spaces, our buildings, and shelter in place at home, the question for me becomes, what does it mean to say that this is a holy place? And that the dining table where I have Shabbat dinner, it's supposed to be a holy place, but it's also the table where I pay the bills and my kid does his homework. And so how do we make our homes sacred? How do we make our places of connection sacred? And of course, Huram, you're talking about hospital work, and I don't know any more sacred place than the halls of a hospital, but I didn't learn that until I did my chaplaincy rotation. And I think for most people who don't work in chaplaincy, they don't realize that that too can be holy ground. So for me, one of the questions that the pandemic opens up is, what does it mean to bring sacred space with us?
Wow. So I think, Rachel, maybe when you were talking about the temples in Jerusalem, that reminded me of something that you mentioned during our conversation, was that, during the most difficult days of the pandemic, that you really leaned into Jewish texts and traditions. So maybe could you sort of explain or expand a little bit about how they offered a path through that time of uncertainty for you as a spiritual leader?
So one of my great joys with my colleagues at Bayit, this little nonprofit that I co-founded, is that the board of directors meets on Monday nights, not for a board meeting, but for Torah study, to learn together. And not for the sake of our sermons, we're not all clergy, but just learning for its own sake. And it happened that in 2020, the text that we were studying that year was called the Eish Kodesh, which means holy fire. It's the writings of the rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto. And he's writing about things like, what it was like for him and his community to be confined and penned in and ill. And there was one particular week where he talked about, his writings, these are his weekly sermons that got written down after the Sabbath was over. And one week he's talking about, we may not be able to gather together. We may not be allowed to come together to worship. We may be confined to our homes. Maybe we can't even send our children to school. And we're all reading this going, oh, wow, yeah, no, that sounds like now. And his core teaching for me was that even in times like that, or especially in times like that, we have to keep trying to do what's right. We have to keep doing the mitzvot, the commandments, the ethical and spiritual practices that our tradition has given us. That's how we find the inner resources to get through. And so a lot of what I gave over to my congregation, to the community that I serve over the last year, has been drawn from his wisdom. And it's really pretty humbling and extraordinary to be able to share those teachings.
Thank you. Karam, you've observed sort of, you mentioned it earlier, societal movement towards sort of a spiritual but not religious identity. So not just here in the US, but internationally as well. So, whether a faith leader's work is on the ground, in your case, or behind the pulpit, I mean, how can today's faith leaders integrate that widespread desire for higher meaning or purpose with, a seeming rejection, I guess, of specific affiliation? Can that be overcome?
Great question. Of course, a lot has been said about it. A lot could be said right now too. I'll try to keep it brief and say that I think depending on which team you're on, every time you see those survey results come out, you're either cheering or you're like, oh shucks, right? Our team's just lost a few, or our team's going up. But I think it's important to keep in mind that even in its literal name, spiritual but not religious, I think whoever's doing the sort of the moaning or the cheering are sort of focusing on the not religious, and not also seeing the affirmation that's there, like owning the title of spiritual and owning that dimension of their personality or their person. So I guess the question is then, how do we as faith leaders get into that space of somebody who finds spirituality enriching and meaningful? My personal definition is that spirituality is informed by the beliefs and the values that help you make meaning and find a meaning in your circumstances and experiences, whatever those may be. So I'll use the example of my mother very briefly, if I may. She's a person who, as long as I've known her, has had very strong, prayerful life, very devoted and devout. Over the years, that she's in her 70s now, she remains an active learner in her faith. Right? Takes her prayer very seriously, does extra prayers. She so I hope I've painted a picture. At the same time, the kind of meaning and value that she gets from making and hosting a Sunday dinner is something that is crucial to the very core of her being. If God forbid she suffered some sort of accident that would compromise her ability to either prepare or host a meal, it would be devastating to her. And that has almost nothing to do with how she experiences her faith, her religious life. There's no commandment that she's trying to put into practice. And if we could tease out some links about the importance of hospitality and what traditions say about that. But I don't think that she's going into the minutia of the tradition when she just feels this natural expression of herself unfold when she's able to perform these weekly rituals. So I guess what I'd like to say or think is that everybody has something like that. Everybody is accessible in their spirituality in this way. And it's up to us to use the appropriate language to meet people where they are and find those access points. Again, I take a lot of heart from seeing the affirmation about the spiritual dimension being present and valued.
Yeah, no, I mean, this has been so awesome. I mean, I really appreciate, as I'm sure our audience does, the perspectives that each of you brings from your different vantage points within the larger faith community. I see we're getting a few questions, so I'd encourage all of you to add some more. But before we move to the audience Q&A, I'm going to ask the three panelists one more question. You can answer in any order, but that is, how have you witnessed the faith practices of, your family members? Well, you just talked about one, Karam, but also, friends, colleagues, your congregants, or your patients. I mean, how have you seen them deepen or not, I guess, during this time of COVID?
Go ahead, Gail. No? All right. Thank you. I'll say that as so much of our material, our space has migrated to a virtual platform. We spoke about this earlier, that the most dreaded phrase in modern communication is like, due to COVID, because there's going to be some bad news that's going to come after it, right? Something has been taken away from me. Something that I'm used to is not what I expect it to be, because you just said the words due to COVID. But I think we have a generation of people who are interested in learning about themselves and their connection to others, that are open to virtual platforms, that prefer texting to calling, that and enjoy so many different communal activities, over in virtual space, where they can sometimes slow down, rewind, speed up, and rewatch what the content that they like. So as much as there is a sort of hesitation around, but we've never done this before, I feel like there's a lot of people who are like, but why aren't you doing it? And that there is an opportunity, especially among, you know, I'll say people younger than I am, who have this appetite and are open to exploring ways of engaging their spirituality if we can find a way to make it available to them.
I will follow that up. I appreciate, although sting a little bit with the people younger than you, but that's okay. And in all seriousness, I will follow that by saying at the church where I serve, where people are older than you, many of the people, due to COVID, what many people started to do was say, how can I do something physical? And so people were still gathering food. There was a teenager at our church who reached out to me on her own and said, are there people in the congregation who need food? And she gathered some of her high school friends. She's a first year in college now, but last year around this time when she was a senior in high school, got 3 or 4 of her friends and they bought food and delivered it to people in our church who were on the food insecure end of things. And so that, I love how you use that phrase, Karam, the due to COVID, but that has also brought on some really beautiful things. One person who's not even a member of our congregation, but really appreciates the kind of work that we do, gave a significant financial gift to the church and said, use this for people in the church who are in need. And that's an amazing thing. I saw one of the questions someone said, how are you intentionally building community in this digital time? And so we are going to continue to do things online because there are people like that person who doesn't even attend Caldwell, but knows about it and wants to be involved and wants to support. And many of those connections were made, I love your phrase, due to COVID. And so that's definitely something that we have seen.
We have to. Congregation Beth Israel is the little synagogue of North Adams. It's the synagogue of Northern Berkshire. It was Orthodox in 1896, and then it was conservative, and then it was unaffiliated, and it's been reformed for the last 20 years, but we're really the only game in town. And so we have a diverse, tiny little community, religiously diverse. And we also have members who have moved away, who aren't local anymore. And during COVID, we were able to celebrate with them and pray with them and mourn with them over Zoom. And that's been extraordinary. One of the practices that I've learned during the pandemic is when I lead worship, I'm using slides, right, with words and images so that wherever we are, we're all seeing the same thing on our screens. And every so often I put in a slide that says face to face. And that reminds me to stop the slides and get it to where we can all see each other again in all the places that we are. And now that we're having hybrid worship at the synagogue, where there's some people in the room on site and other people on Zoom, I still do that so that we can see each other and remember that we're connected, that we're not alone. And even though the way I'm doing it is maybe a little clunky, it feels so spiritually important. Maybe that's the biggest learning of the pandemic for me, is that we're really not alone if we can find ways to connect.
And if we can find ways to own our clunky humanity and walk with one another. Now I get to get emotional, right? It's like, if nothing else, that's what the COVID has taught me, right? That we are clunky, messy people, and we desperately need each other, and we need faith. Everybody believes in something, even if you believe in yourself. We need community desperately, and all the more now that we see, now that we are at this stage and we've seen what we've seen over the last 20 months.
So I think this is a perfect pivot now to our questions from our audience. And the one that Gail was alluding to earlier was submitted by Rob Benson. And we sort of touched on it, but I'm just going to read it out to see if there's any sort of additional insights you want to add. So he says, our church is beginning to consider how to engage with the people who have been connecting exclusively digitally, especially people who live outside the area. Any sense of how your faith communities are doing so intentionally? And perhaps a parallel question, is there a reasonable limit to directing finite energy in such a far-flung way? Anyone?
I mean, the short version for me is that we are figuring it out as we go. We are trying to connect. You know, because we're a small congregation, there might be days when I only have a dozen people in the room or fewer. Sometimes we don't have a minion of 10, the 10 adults required as a quorum for communal prayer. And that was true before COVID, and it's still true now. But for me, if someone's joining us on Zoom, they are in the room where it happens. And so that's a shift in perspective, where once upon a time I might have broadcast a service for someone who was homebound or in the hospital. Right? You can watch it on your device, but it's just coming to you. You're a consumer. You're like watching TV. Now we try to make it interactive, recognizing that an increasing number of people are connecting from afar. And I think, as I think on it, I think the clunkiness of our setup and the imperfections of how we do it actually turn out to be important. It reminds everyone that we're all real human beings and we're all figuring this out as we go. And none of us have ever lived through a global pandemic before, much less tried to rabbi through one or pastor through one or chaplain through one. So we're all beginners at this. And I think we're all doing the best we can.
Yeah. I think to that, I would add that, you know, like whatever you put out there, Rob, that is reaching wherever, you know, even if it's a YouTube channel that you have for your place of worship, that's sort of reserving the thoughts, the reflections that are being produced at this time. I think they're valuable at maybe even as an artifact for your community to be able to look back and reflect on over time, even if it feels like it's going out into the ether and disappearing, and where are the views and what's the point. I like to think that there can be a long impact, and that we never know when someone decides to pick up the phone on the other end.
Thanks, guys. So Kim Bohannon has asked, we've kind of touched on this too, but I think there could be some more nuance. What is a new or epiphanal even practice that you've used during our time of pandemic that has changed you, but also changed how you've kept up the relationships with your church family, your community?
A new thing that we've done to, is that what it said? Okay. Well, at our church for a while, it was probably a year, we are not doing it right now, but one of the things that we did for a while on Thursday evenings was something we called Vespers, which was a time to come together and quiet. You know, we lit candles, even though we were staring at a screen, we each had a candle that we lit, and we talked to one another, we prayed, we shared our joys and our concerns, and it was a way to connect. And that was really beautiful and important. And there were people, as came up in the previous question, who participated. One person who is a part of our community, but has herself been in seminary in California. We're in North Carolina. So she was able to reconnect through that. And so that was just a beautiful practice that, you know, maybe we will even get back to. I really enjoyed it. And at the same time, and I think this came up with one of the other questions or comments, we were exhausted because we were trying to do so many things on so many nights in so many ways, and all of it online, planted in chairs in front of computer screens. It was hard, but that was definitely a way that we connected in our faith community here in Charlotte.
Can I add to that really quickly? So there was a period where I think we felt like we're supposed to maintain pretty strong boundaries between what is professional, what is personal. And so, you know, your personal information, your personal email, your personal phone number, that you have to be very sort of fastidious about who gets access to those. But at some point during the pandemic, it decided that, no, I'm going to share my work phone number just to see what happens and create, you know, communities and chat groups and text groups, group text messages with some colleagues. And we got to a point where we were able to start sharing memes with one another. And I mean that in all sincerity, that there's a level of intimacy and friendship, like friendliness, that you arrive. And I think this is a new phenomenon, but I think that it is a real thing, that you reach a level of familiarity with someone that you can, without context or any preamble, just send them a meme and they'll get to it when they get to it. And when that first meme popped up, I was so thrilled, so thrilled. So if you have that bandwidth and capacity to, be open to those notifications going off whenever, I think it's a pretty cool thing that we're able to do these days that we weren't able to do before.
And I think it's important to remember that we still need joy. We still need laughter. And I think that was one of it's hard to find that balance, right? Of like, this is a very serious thing. A pandemic is very serious. Faith can be very serious. And also, I believe that all of our faith founders laughed. And I believe that they want us to be people of joy and of hope. And so I think whether it's a meme or a joke or just an inside story that makes people laugh within our faith traditions, I think that also is life sustaining.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, that's great. So now we're going to take sort of a little bit of a more serious turn. And Joan Tarburton is saying, I feel that in our schools, workplaces, in the world, it is becoming increasingly hostile for more pious, observant, Orthodox believers. How do we teach our kids to be brave and spiritual in this minefield? How do we do this at work?
Boy, that's a big question, Joan, and I feel you in that. I think a lot about how I'm trying to raise my son, who's almost 12, to be bold and brave in his Jewishness, and also unafraid of friends who are part of other faith traditions or no faith tradition, or may in some cases even come from households that are hostile to faith tradition. I can tell you that for me, the best answer I have is to be real with him about what it means to me to be Jewish, to be a person of faith, to be in conversation with God. And he knows that, like, one of his best friends comes from a household where God is really not a word that people use. And yet in our household, we talk to God all the time. And he just, okay, like, families are different. This family does this thing and that family does that thing. And so there's a building a kind of comfort with the fact that not all of his friends are going to be growing up in faithful households. And part of this also is being a Jewish person in a small town. I mean, Williamstown is a wonderful small town, but it's still a small town. And he's the only rabbi's kid at the school. Early in the pandemic, he overheard my colleagues and me studying the Rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto. And we were talking about a passage that says that the children of Israel cried out and God heard their cries. And he came into my study, it was late at night, and said, "Mom, are we still the children of Israel?" And I said, "Of course we are, honey. That's one of our names for ourselves." And he said, "Well, then why isn't God fixing the pandemic? Are we just not crying out enough? Like, why isn't God making it all okay?" And I thought, oh boy, like, this is the moment where your childhood theology becomes complicated. And so we talked about how I believe that God does hear our cry, and that we can see God's presence in the people who are working so hard to create vaccines. Back when we didn't have any of those, and now we have 3. So maybe also finding a way to frame the miracles of our modern life as something that bolsters our faith, not something that's in contradiction to our faith. That's what I've got.
And I would say, my children are 25 and 28, which is unbelievable because I'm only 32. So I don't know how they managed to do that. But anyway, for me, in raising my children in the faith and in thinking about that question, is I felt like I had to begin by living it. right? Like I have to show what my faith means to me by reading my Bible and praying and being involved in the church, so that they understand that even when other people are making fun of it, or they think we're, gone off the deep end, or whatever they think, I'm still living out my faith. And also I felt it very important to talk to my children about that faith doesn't protect us from problems. Faith goes with us into it. Faith is what sustains us, as I said before. So we're not going to be, I'm not going to remember the phrase, but I just recently heard somebody say, faith doesn't inoculate us from this stuff. It goes with us into it. It travels with us. So yes, bravery, courage to stand for what we believe, not obnoxiously, not violently, but firmly understanding what my faith tells me about who I am and how I am meant to live. That is the example I set for my children, and hopefully they will follow that example.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question. I can't believe how quickly this has gone by. So it's actually what I can kind of relate to as the elder on the screen here. Cynthia Hilldop says, what are your struggles with older adults who might not be comfortable with technology, and how do you reach out to them?
I mean, we have tried matching some of our young folks with some of our older folks to offer technology lessons, and I would say that is met with varying degrees of success. It's a challenge, and I don't have a great answer to it. I wish that I did.
It definitely is a challenge. And as you said, Rachel, some folks are able to grasp it, some are not. And so for me, I have taken up, and I think of just one or two specific people in my own congregation, is I just call them and I talk to them on the phone and I say, I'm sorry, we can't figure out the technology part of it, but we still consider you, we are all still one community, one family of faith. And I have also, gone to places and sat outside and, kept a safe distance from people, but to just let them know that they are still loved and they are still as much a part of this community, even if they can't get onto Zoom.
So, and it looks like, Karam, you were answering one of the questions, one of the other ones. Oh, but you have responded. Okay. So great. Thank you for doing that. And thank you to everybody who submitted questions. I'm so sorry we aren't able to get to all of them. We just had a few other standing out there, but I respect all your everyone's time. I want to say, thanks again to our three amazing panelists. You've shown us that a liberal arts education can take you anywhere, including closer to the divine. We've added some great resources suggested by each of them in the chat, so feel free to explore those at your leisure. I'd suggest maybe just clicking on them now so you can pull up the tab before we exit the webinar. We'll probably send them to you afterwards too. But thank you, audience, all of you who took time to attend. You will be receiving a super quick survey from Alumni Relations about your experience in the coming days. And we really welcome your feedback. We actually do read it. And we always welcome ideas for future topics for Williams at Work webinars. Maybe you are even interested in being a presenter yourself. So just in case, we're also sharing a link to the Williams at Work webinar submission form in the chat. So anyway, thank you again, and from all of us working for you here in the Purple Valley, including my amazing colleague, Caitlin, who's been running the show behind the scenes. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks so much.